Good morning, everybody, and let's get started with this first session about European political challenges. We've got 4 speakers, and I will introduce them, and then they will have some initial remarks. But the idea is to have as much interaction as possible, so feel free to raise your hands, and we can take it from there. So let's start with Dr. Giacomo Benedetto from Royal Holloway, Dr. Koen Slootmaeckers, okay, not too bad.
It's perfect.
Alexandra Neag, and Yori. Yeah. Okay, right, you're all here. Giacomo, would you like to start?
Yes, well, thank you very much. I'm going to say something about my own experience, but what I think we're facing at the moment in Europe in terms of a political challenge is something which Christopher Hill described in the 1990s as a capabilities expectations gap. Christopher Hill is a scholar of international relations, and in coming up with this term, he was talking about the European Union's foreign policy. The foreign policy and later security policy of the European Union did not meet expectations because its capabilities were far too limited. And we see conflicts within the European zone, whether in Ukraine in more recent years or in the former Yugoslavia during the 1990s, as somehow being an example of Europe failing to deliver an effective foreign and security policy. But I think that the capabilities expectations gap is something that we can use to understand why the European Union is seen as being lacking success in recent years since the financial crisis over the last 10 years, and not only in foreign and security policy, where its powers are always very limited. These are fundamentally an intergovernmental area, foreign and security policy. Europe is unable to respond effectively to challenges where there has been much more integration than in foreign policy, in running or dealing with the migration crisis, and with the financial crisis. These are areas in which we might have expected Europe to respond in a more effective way than it would ever have done in the field of foreign and security policy. And one of the reasons why there's that failure is because from the beginning the expectations are high. Public opinion demands or expects a European response, whether it's with regard to the financial crisis or the migration and refugee crisis. And yet that response doesn't happen. And in my own work, I have been working in recent years on questions of the budget of the European Union. This is a sort of technical issue. It's not the most riveting and exciting issue. But I would argue that for the European Union to be effective, it needs a more effective, larger and more efficient and responsive budget so that it can actually intervene with expenditure. Because all of the solutions that Europe is expected to provide to its current challenges require expenditure. If you're going to have a European border police, a European coast guard, a European system for processing refugees, that needs expenditure. And that expenditure is very, very limited. And there are all kinds of reasons why that's the case. National governments guard the resources and the finances very carefully. They don't trust the European level. But I think before we go too much into that, and I should say how I got here. So I've been working a lot on the budget in recent years. My own history, and this is something which those of you who are doing PhDs might want to reflect on in terms of, thinking, where will I be in 10 or 20 years? Well, we don't know this. I started as a scholar looking at the European Parliament and as a parliamentary scholar, not only the European Parliament, I also did something on the British Parliament over a decade ago. And I was interested in procedures, how law was passed, what the powers of political parties were, whether the European Parliament had more power in some procedures than in others, comparing it with the other part of what the European Union uses for making law, which is the Council of the European Union, which is representing the member states' governments. And a lot of work had been written already by other scholars looking at this in very detailed analysis using game theory. And the one procedure that they hadn't covered, these other scholars, was the budget procedure. And the budget of the European Union still isn't very important, but it has a procedure all of its own. So that was my opportunity for producing one of my first publications just after my PhD. It wasn't part of my PhD. I was a sort of parliaments person, and from that followed offers then to give evidence to the Budget Committee in the European Parliament when it was looking at its own procedures. A later call to tender came out from the European Commission to run workshops on the future of public expenditure in the European Union. And gradually I found myself, and unexpectedly, being sucked into becoming this person who wrote more and more about the budget and less about political parties and the European Parliament, which is what had interested me in the beginning. I don't regret that development, and I think it's something that you can reflect on. Who knows where any of us will be sort of 10 years from now. And when opportunities come along, these particular occasions of interaction with policymakers offers real opportunity. So I'd like to conclude there, and maybe we'll come back on some of these other points later.
Okay, thank you. I'll go next.
All right. Good morning. I'm a recent PhD graduate, so I defended last summer. And I'm now a lecturer. So there's kind of hope for. I like to see myself as a hope for those who are near the end. It's possible, or even in the beginning, it's possible. But my work I'm a sociologist by background, and as academic careers go, I shifted into the realm of international politics, where I now study the EU enlargement process and how it impacts LGBT politics in Europe, and more specifically in the Western Balkans, Serbia, Croatia, etc. And as part of my research, I often find myself thinking about what is Europe and what does it represent and what does this do to its outside its borders. And often we like to talk about Europe as an institution in crisis. It's always some crisis happening, whether it's the financial crisis, the constitutional crisis, the refugee crisis. I would also almost say there is some kind of identity crisis going on as well. As many of you know, the EU defines itself as founded on fundamental values, principles of democracy, etc. That's kind of the new mantra of the EU, and part of my work is trying to undermine this idea that this is actually true. Because if you look at the interaction between the EU and its foreign or its third countries, suddenly you can start seeing cracks in how this idea of what does Europe actually mean is represented and what does it do in terms of political outcomes. So if we look, for example, at recent years in what happens in Hungary, now in Poland, but similarly also in Denmark with its new ghetto law, which, in all fairness, and this can be edited, is shambolic, it kind of shows that this idea that Europe is fundamentally liberal and that it's based upon fundamental values of equality and fairness or even democracy, I think needs to be questioned. Are we really that democratic? Are we really founded upon these principles? Now, I would almost argue saying that actually no. Europe is almost fundamentally founded upon illiberal principles. If we think about how the European democracy came about, it's all through process of colonialism and process of exclusion. Our liberalism is fundamentally founded upon illiberal practices, which as we progress, we have kind of tried to move outside our political spectrum. Colonialism has been abolished. We try to be politically correct in terms of how we treat others. We're not really succeeding. If you look at how Hungary is going, Poland is going, Denmark is going, Brexit is also a very good example of how we're not able to deal with others and how we're always very self-centric and kind of trying to focus on our own needs first before the others. Now, I think raising this question is really important because it draws a lot of problems in how the EU deals with its external countries. If you look at the relationship between the EU and Serbia, which is my main focus in my research, the EU tries to export its fundamental values to Serbia in ways of making it proper European enough to become part of the EU. Now, because these fundamental values, which the EU prides to be founded on, are actually only really taking place in European discourse since the late 1980s and the 1990s, basically with the fall of communism and the Soviet Union, as a way of demarking and creating the idea what is Europe. Because before the fall of the Berlin Wall, there was a clear sense that Europe meant Western Europe, the so-called progressive, liberal, exceptional space of modernity, versus the second world, the communist world, as in this backward, non-capitalist, God knows what else. When the Berlin Wall fell, this distinction suddenly became questionable, and Europe had to define itself. Democracy and principles of fundamental rights, human rights, became the key way of making this distinction between what is exceptionally liberal, i.e. Western Europe. When we talk about the EU, we often talk about only Western Europe. I don't know whether you realize, but most of the discourse about Europe are always related to Western Europe. Eastern Europe is forgotten, as in it's like this little brother of the EU that needs still coaching in how do you be European. And this kind of makes that this idea of fundamental values is fundamentally a hollow trope, as a way of just making distinctions. Now, if you want to export the hollow trope to transform countries to become part of this European family, how do you do this? How do you export values that you don't know what they mean? Now, the EU has, in its enlargement process, made this clear by exporting institutions, exporting the rule of law, exporting certain democratic procedures in parliaments, the elections, and legislation that deals with anti-discrimination. That is a key way of ensuring that the new member states become democratic and liberal. Now, the fundamental flaw here is, and I think this is where my critiques of everything I do in my work comes to, is that institutions are also kind of empty, can always go both ways. The only reason why actually, if you think about it, can go both ways. Look at what happens in America and in Trump. The so-called very healthy checks and balances are fundamentally undermined with the now currently, for Trump's administration, more and more these processes which we deem to be irreversible are being reversed. So if that's already happening in all democracies, obviously institutions in so-called new democracies are prone to manipulation. Can go either way, back and forth. Happened in Hungary, happening in Poland as well. It's actually happening in Serbia as well. The EU is, by focusing so much on process, or at least on tick boxes, as in quick checks of what the democracy looks like, it has installed an authoritarian regime, or semi-authoritarian regime, I should say, which is focusing so much on delivering the reforms the EU is looking for, but in a way which fundamentally undermines the values the EU is trying to export. So, this long story short, I think one of the biggest political challenges, and this is where I came to when I started thinking about this talk, is what does Europe mean? What do we think about when we talk about the EU and its fundamental rights identity? And can we take this so-called idea that Western Europe is this exceptional space of democracy, can we really take this for granted? And if we do so, what are we doing to those other countries in the third, or non-EU countries, or even those countries which aren't following these principles anymore? And then the bigger question is, where the sociologist in me comes forward, is what does it do to people living in those countries? Who is excluded through this system, and who is constantly othered? Who is always taking as the scapegoat of anything that goes wrong in order to maintain that we are a democratic and liberal society? And I'll end on this note. Slightly pessimistic, but...
Slightly pessimistic. Well, then let's try to see if our other two speakers can move to brighter sides of the EU equation.
I'm afraid...
or we continue with pessimism, that's okay.
So my PhD is looking at criminal justice and policy transference. So because of that, I'm going to be talking about slightly pessimistic stuff as well. I'm specifically looking at organized crime, which is one of those criminal justice areas which has been talked about so much, like terrorism, and which really rallies people to one side or another, usually one side. Essentially, the process of policy transference is most of the time a one-way street. You usually have the powerful countries, the Western countries, providing a model, and then other countries, usually developing countries, or in the case of the EU, Central Eastern European countries, doing the accommodating, adopting those models, adopting the pieces of legislation, and then trying to work with those within their national contexts. The issue with having this kind of what's basically a very neo-colonial legal practice of exporting one's legal system to other countries and expecting them to adopt those regardless of what their national climates are like, what the national interests are like. It brings up questions of legitimacy. So when we talk about the, European approach to organized crime and give some of the policing capabilities or policing rights, which normally are national, to Europol, for instance, how does that reflect the social contract between the individual and the state? Because we all, when we enter the social contract with the state, we kind of have that understanding that the state is going to protect us. But when we instead, without any kind of in-depth conversation about it, give some of these responsibilities to extra-national bodies like Europol or like the EU, how does that change the relationship between us and the state, or the relationship between us and the European Parliament? And that's one of the things that people have come to realize now. In Eastern Europe especially, there's been a lot of backlash against some of the, like you were saying, some of the values that the EU is promoting, whether it's LGBT legislation, whether it's criminal justice legislation we've seen in Hungary, in Romania, in Poland. There is a backlash from the people against certain things being imposed by the EU, but this is an old tradition. Since the EU has been formed and since it started expanding, this is what it's been done. And it's not just within the EU. This is a process that happens through NATO, through the UN, and through a lot of different international bodies. And it's now starting to be questioned, and that's not, obviously it's not the best way of dealing with it, but it's not something that we should look down on the fact that people are deciding or are trying to decide whether they want to give some of these rights to Europe, or to, I'm saying rights, but it's really responsibilities to Europe and to European institutions, or whether they want to just keep them at the national level. So in terms of criminal justice policies, this practice of taking something that works in the West and imposing it in either Central Eastern Europe or other areas of development, or South America, Africa, the Far East, anything like that, without paying careful consideration to national interests, it causes certain problems because, and not just national interests, but also national context. So after the fall of the communist regime in Central Eastern Europe, we had certain remnants of it, say the political corruption, which kind of continued to exist there. But that's not really something that criminal justice policy on organized crime, corruption, that sort of stuff is really taking in when it's being dictated by Brussels and applied in Budapest or Bucharest or Sofia or anywhere. So again, that brings questions of authority and legitimacy, and this move towards federalization and towards a European police force and perhaps towards even European armed forces. That's something that is slowly happening, and I think the discussion about it is useful, although difficult in the kind of post-truth era that we're all finding ourselves in. But I don't think we should fear that conversation, and I think that it's part of our responsibility as academics to bring our own understandings of this process into it and try to inform public opinion and not just dismiss it as fake news and yeah.
Okay, thank you. And so we're going to move to our last speaker.
Hi,
Please.
morning. I'm Yuri. I'm from the School of Hospitality and Tourism Management at the University of Surrey. And my research looks at the productivity within the hospitality and tourism sector. I've been invited to this panel. And in regards to my research, which focuses on the productivity side, I feel it's very related to the current political, like the European challenges. I think I take a bit more of an economic perspective on this. And of course, at the moment, in the context of the UK, productivity is a big issue at the moment. I don't know whether you've seen on the news, or, but productivity has been a big issue, a long time issue, especially after the 2008 economic crisis. From then on, the so-called productivity council has been within the government policies and strategies, and it's still been going on. And it refers to like the stagnant growth of productivity at the moment after the economic recession. And regarding the productivity, especially with Brexit that has happened, and with that concern, productivity is also heightening in terms of concerns in the industry, in the government in the UK. This is not just the case for the UK, it's for most of the advanced economies and also emerging economies, which the OECD is also looking into to solve this productivity issue. As everyone knows, with Brexit, we have the issues of migration and also the movement of, let's say, European labour workers in a year's time. And with this issue, it's very concerning because the UK will be lacking in terms of the knowledgeable workers, I would say, and also, especially in the context of tourism and hospitality, where I come from, we are very highly reliant on European labour. You know, whether you experience it, but within the sector, there's a lot of migrant labour. And with this Brexit and the restriction on labour in consequence of the Brexit, it's something very concerning in our sector. But also I feel is overall a big concern in terms of the loss of human capital that we face in the post-Brexit situation. So I feel this really brings to question and concern to really think about the productivity issue. Whereas in the UK government at the moment, in the industrial strategy, there has been a lot of investment to target the productivity issue in the UK, and it's something the government's really trying to push towards it. But one sad side that I feel, well, let's say positive side, would be there are a lot of investment towards the digital economy within the UK to boost our productivity, since we have this technological shift. And given that, it's a very good sign that the government is doing something, but then coming from a low-skill sector of tourism and hospitality, there's not much focus on that. And there are economists and researchers and academics who actually talk about what about the low-skill sectors that the UK has. Are there going to be any investments on that? Are there going to be any changes in visas or regulations in regards to the low-skilled sector? So I think that poses a lot of questions and concerns, especially in our sector, but I presume other low-skilled sectors which doesn't have a lot of light to it in terms of their issue of productivity. that's really my concern and view. Especially, I think the UK proposed, the government, the Home Office, proposed that they're going to double the tier 1 visas for the high skills and high knowledgeable migrants. But again, that's a focus on the digital side and the digital economy. And also that's something concerning in terms of the low skilled. Because just to end with an anecdotal story, I would say, I moved here when I was very young with my family, and my dad being in the hospitality and tourism sector. Back then, which is more than 20 years ago, the tier 1 visa was obviously more open. The visa policies were more softer, it was more open to everyone. And a lot of skills were, a lot of people were given the tier 1 visa after their postgraduate or undergraduates. And my dad used to do that, and a lot of people around my community had the chance, who are non-Europeans, of getting that tier 1 visa. And then after the EU enlargement, and then we had that free movement of labour within the European Union, a lot of European people came in, and I think that kind of filled up that supply of labour. And then the UK decided to make the migration regulations and laws a bit more stricter. But then now it's again another cycle of this issue with people. Now we have the Brexit, so people are going to move away, and then we'll still have that skill gap, we'll have that gap in the labour and human capital and knowledge. So I feel, is there any new strategies, or is it worth going back to opening that visa regulations, like smoothing a bit out, making it less strict? Because I think that, of course, the government is changing the visa regulations and stuff, but what other things could they do? Changing the visa, making it less strict, how are they going to tackle the low sector? So if anyone has any views on this, it would be very interesting to hear. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, when I was asked to chair this panel, I thought it was going to be an hour and a half of Brexit talks. But actually, you've all touched upon a number of very interesting points that somehow relate to Brexit, as the visa system, and I think your question on changes to the visa systems and how we look at skilled versus unskilled workers is something that's really requires some attention and debate. But you've been talking about, Alexandra, been talking about criminal justice and the integration of criminal justice, the implication that has for the individual who is in a social contract with a particular state, which sort of delegates some of its powers to a higher entity, and clearly a number of countries and a number of individuals don't feel comfortable enough in this type of setup. We have been talking about how liberal our democratic practices are, and I think that that's something I've been interested myself in. I study public opinion, and public opinion about European institutions tends to be extremely low. We know that in general, public opinion on institutions, on states and state actors is as a high dispersion around a very low mean. But when it comes to European institutions, I think the mean is even lower, because many of us really don't quite understand how EU institutions work, and we perceive them as absolutely alien to our day-to-day life. So this lack of contact sort of fuels distrust and detachment from the European institution. And I would like you to reflect upon this, how that relates to your work and your initial remarks. And I would invite the audience to intervene and just step into the discussion. It's very open, very informal.
I can start.
Sure.
Extending your findings that the public opinion regarding your institution is very low, so we can assume that people perceive institution as existing in another reality. So we can talk about you as a politician, as a person. And in this case, in terms of capabilities expectation gap, the problem is initially it was very high expectation, but the high expectation is a typical way to be elected for any politician. You need to promise something. And usually 99% out of 100, those politicians who promise who will deliver everything, they usually say, I usually don't. So do you think that it is a problem with the EU? Because at the initial creation of the EU, they were kind of politicians taking promises on which they making promises which they would not fulfill, and now it is a problem.
I'm going to turn to Giacomo because he was telling us about his first life as a scholar of EU institutions and parties.
Yes, well, I suppose I still am, because I'm a scholar now of public policy. So that's looking at the darker side of how decisions are made. Yes, I hadn't really thought of it in that way. Of course, the EU has not been an electoral institution for very long, and arguably it's not very successful, despite the fact that the European Parliament has been elected. It's not very successful at being an electoral institution. The EU institutions at the beginning were never designed to be democratic. That wasn't the intention, and there are scholars who write about how it's not really desirable. The EU is doing something else. Think about central banks. Those of us who are from the UK, of course, the European Central Bank is controversial because of the Eurozone crisis. But if you're British, we have the Bank of England, and the Bank of England is a technical institution. The people on it are not politicians, and they make decisions about interest rates. Judges. In Europe, in European countries, unlike in the United States, judges are not elected. It's not desirable that judges should be elected. So there is a consensus within some of the literature that these technical institutions, whether it's the judiciary or whether it's banks that set interest rates, shouldn't be elected. And that same approach was the original technical approach of the European Union 60 years ago, that it shouldn't be something which is elected. And indeed, when the European Parliament was given power, as it was starting in 1970 and then again in the 1980s, it was given this very significant extra power. It wasn't at the time because politicians thought there was a problem with a democratic deficit. They wanted, by giving power to the European Parliament, it was a technical solution to create some checks and balances within the EU system. Because otherwise you'd have had a situation where the European Commission and a majority of the governments of the European Union could have taken decisions that would have outvoted other governments being forced to comply with decisions in which they didn't agree. At least if you had the European Parliament as part of the process, it would be more open and there would be a check and balance. But it wasn't because of any concern back in 1970 or back in 1987 when these reforms happened. There wasn't a concern about the democratic deficit. That only emerges about 5 years later in the 1990s. And just on the expectations, they're very great. It is known that we have a single European currency, the euro. We have a Schengen area within the European Union, notionally with a common external frontier. It is therefore an expectation that the European Union, with these European policies, should be managing the economic growth for economics and the migration flows in a more robust way, and yet it isn't. The external border whether it's the external border on the eastern part of Poland or the Mediterranean external border, is guarded on the most part by national police, coast guards and border officials. It's not Europeanized. We can argue about why that is, but that is how the expectations have not been fulfilled.
And NATO on the borders.
Yeah.
I think another point that I think is really important to consider is the way in which the elections are run. As in, if you think about European elections, it's always very much nationally based. You elect your national parties, and I mean, I know I'm very critical of the EU because I have high expectations of the EU, and I believe it can be a good institution. But one of the things that bothers me a lot is that the political discussions about Europe are always nationally. How can you have a discussion about what is good for Europe if when I'm electing politicians to represent my country, or actually represent me as a citizen, I can only have national debates. I can only vote for those who are within my geographic electoral area. So as a politician, I'm Belgian, by the way, so I'm very much in this so-called democratic system where we have actually two democracies trying to work together. It's a very nice example of how it doesn't work. We've been also the country with the longest time without government, exactly because of this reason. As a Flemish person, or at least I don't identify as Flemish, so let me rephrase this. As a person from the Dutch-speaking part of Belgium, I can't. It's a very political statement to make this statement. So, as a person from the Dutch-speaking part of Belgium, I can't vote for politicians from the French side. Which means that Flemish nationalism, and this is why I say what I say, is extremely big in Flanders. Because Flemish politicians don't have to argue for getting votes from the French citizens. Same here. Politicians in the UK don't have to consider other Europeans as their electorate. So their interests aren't part of what they want to do. So the only thing it actually does is you reinforce national identifications and national ways of doing politics into a supranational system, which then obviously can't act in a supranational way. Now, the parliament has more powers. It's not the most powerful institution within the EU, and many of the aspects, I agree, should be technocratic. But it's more about how do you create expectations of citizens if you only have national-orientated discussions, especially in cases where it's easy to blame the EU because most of the people don't know how the EU works. That to me is one of the most biggest, I mean, I'm not a Brexit scholar, I never want to be, it's so depressing, but one of the reasons I think Brexit happened is because the UK political elite has been blaming the EU for decades for everything that was undesirable, whilst then suddenly in 6 months before the referendum, Cameron comes out saying, oh no, the EU is good, after saying decades it's been terrible institution, despite whatever the way the UK voted within the council. So I think these kind of management of political problems of who are you speaking for, which is also the underlying idea of my previous talk, is what creates a problem.
We have a question here.
I don't know if any of your research touches upon this. This is very much a personal remark. I'm not studying this at all. But what role do you think education has in all of this? So I'm French and British and grew up in France. I went through the whole French school system. And in France, there's no question when you do history and geography, Europe is a good thing. And you're taught about all the institutions, all the years that each country joined, why it all exists. So technically, theoretically, all French people know what's going on in Europe. Then and we all don't all do Erasmus, but we all know people who go on Erasmus. It's very common, very normal. So in most French people of my age, I think there's not as much
there's a pretty strong correlation between level of education and attitudes towards Europe. But whether that is because of what people are being taught in school, or they come into contact with different sorts of people at university level, I mean, we can all like say our opinions.
Yes. Yeah, this is just my opinion. This is not actual fact.
I think, yeah, it would be useful for everyone to understand where the European Union is actually coming from, because I think a lot of people now either don't remember what Europe was like before the EU or have never lived through that. So there's not that kind of direct experience with what diplomacy used to be like, what conflicts used to be resolved, in what manner they used to be resolved, or what trade used to be like, all that sort of stuff. Whether we should go back to that time to see what it would look like now and then decide, do we still want the EU? I don't think so. But yeah, perhaps through education, through explaining the whole process of how we got here today, and just, yeah, looking at the good parts, the bad parts, and honestly discussing them, that could be a good way of understanding what we actually want from the Union itself.
I would say, I don't want to preempt anything that Anon Menon might say this afternoon, and he is more knowledgeable about the public opinion aspects of Brexit than I am. But from what I am aware, polling evidence has shown that there is one of the most reliable indicators of voting either for or against leaving the European Union was level of education. And there are several explanations for this. So it's not the simplistic one that because you're better educated, you're more intelligent, and therefore you understand the issues more and you vote to stay in the European Union. There are some other explanations that go with it, and perhaps the most convincing is that if you're better educated, you have a better chance of being able to take advantage of the opportunities of globalization, rather than you are more sophisticated and therefore you make a better choice. So there are lots of these explanations. In terms of the British school system, I'd say it would be very rare for teenagers in school in the UK to cover any aspect of history after 1945. As for Germany, ever since 1949, there is complete ignorance. And yet Germany, after 1949, is probably the most successful model of democratization and a successful democracy that exists.
Sorry, can I?
Yes.
Could you just because I went to school in Germany and there they teach you the same, so you learn everything about your Union and things like that. So, because I understood it, you said if you don't learn anything after 1949.
In Britain, after 1945, it depends. It's very, very limited what is learned about contemporary history since 1945.
Yeah, maybe something to do with the Cold War, but not things to do with the EU. Or, more about US, Russia.
I mean, you can't study the Cold War without studying the EU, because the EU, well, that's ridiculous, because the EU, since the 1950s, was a civilian arm of Western security, right? Western security was not only about having nuclear weapons with which to deter a Soviet attack. Western security since the 1950s was about having economic prosperity and stability in Western Europe, supported by the Americans, in order to discourage West Europeans, notably in countries like France and Italy, from voting communist, right? So it was part of a very much an economic, home front type motivation that drove the early stages of European economic integration, fundamental to the Cold War.
No, I mean, I agree. I mean, I'm just talking about the lack of rigor in history.
Sure.
But
this is a question about how do you I mean, history is never neutral, so I mean, I guess we all agree on this. Like, it depends on how you interpret your histories. As in Belgium, we talk about we are the founding member of Europe, and we are the example upon which Europe has been founded. That's kind of the narrative you get. We have a very Belgian exceptionalism way in how we are the role model of Europe, which I'm not necessarily fond of, but then if you look at the UK, there's very much more Commonwealth, I mean, at least in my understanding, a lot more Commonwealth oriented without really digging into the dark side of colonialism. But it's this, especially if I think back about Brexit debates, is this like, let's go back to the Commonwealth sense of like, let's claim back our power as in the global power in our own, as we used to be. A very nostalgic kind of returning to what it was to be part of the Commonwealth. So that's part of, I guess, the things we're talking about. How is your nation positioned within the international politics through the interpretation of history is one element. But then the role of education, I think, is also very important in terms of creating openness and the possibility of interpret your environment in a more complex way, rather than just having knowledge of Europe. Because in the end, the referendum on both sides was shambolic in terms of its campaign. It was full of lies on either side. Nobody knew what they were talking about. So the vote was not informed upon knowing the EU. I think it's more informed about fear of the other, fear of who do I want to blame for my lack of being able to take advantage of globalization as a very big driver. And here, as a sociologist, education is the key driver of fear of the other. It's that part that makes people more open, whether it's being able to interpret your environment more complexly or whether it's having more opportunities to meet other people. So, I mean, education is very, I don't know, I always find it really tricky to unpack how it works because nobody knows how it works. But it's more about creating spaces to reflect.
Our education on Europe and France was also kind of implicitly built on the fear of the other, because I caught myself in my early 20s having quite negative stereotypes of like Eastern Europe and Russia, and that's through the history kind of stuff that Europe is one thing and then all the others. So our implicitly it was all built on this is what Europe isn't.
And I think also in the same way that you were saying that education is tricky, also education research is tricky because it often comes out years after certain educational approaches are implemented. So what you were saying about people being taught about colonialism but not the dark side of colonialism, I'm sure that would have been the case maybe 10 years ago, but people who are finishing school now are pretty aware of the dark side of colonialism and are quite are internalizing the whole, similar to how in Germany people, you know, take blame for the Holocaust even though they were born much, much later. In the same way, people are now understanding colonialism as it's their fault, it's part of their identity, that they have been responsible for this and they should make amends for it. But I don't think current research necessarily is showing that because those cohorts are quite recent and they haven't really been studied. So it's always, I think, catching up with new programs, new approaches.
Yeah, despite. Oh, sorry.
Got one there first, sorry.
I was just thinking about education, but rather than history in terms of skills, thinking about the productivity issue we were discussing. And, you know, I think I'm just putting forward an opinion and thought about how businesses have been relying on foreign labour in this country, for example, to fulfil skills gaps and their needs, and often those labour would often do low-paid jobs which Brits don't want to do, for example. And I don't know if there's something to say about Brexit and, you know, whether we need to invest rather than just rely on external labour that can fill those needs, or investing in our own productivity and our own labour force, and, you know, not just invest in those highly educated university students who can take advantage of globalisation, but also those from the sort of lower skilled sectors in our own country.
Yeah, I think that's
value them.
Yeah, I think it's a important point because ultimately we will need to rely on our own local national labour. And I do know that the industrial strategy do have money for investment in terms of training and development with the UK labour. But again, it's very I view it very biased towards the highly skilled And we, in our sector, we do have, and in our discipline, we do have these debates on the educational side. So, I mean, like, just taking the case of hospitality and tourism, because I'm in a sector, I think parents have that perception that jobs in hospitality and tourism is not that great. And then the students or the children won't even think of going towards that. And hence, that's why we have a low supply of labour, which then the foreign labour ought to get in, because it's quite low paid, everyone has that perception. It's bad working hours, seasonality issue, etc. The work conditions are so poor, and I think that's what the parents have a view of that as well. So if a kid's like, oh, I'm going to go into hospitality, I want to be a hotelier, then the parents will be like, no, you're not going to be a hotelier, you're going to be someone else. So I think education really becomes a big part of that. I think people just to tackle towards the low skill sector education, and I think children's perception is really need to be open, especially about the debates that we've been having. I think education plays a big role, because that's when the kids start to grow up and they start to find their identity. And if we're not taught that, I think like what you've experienced and what I've experienced as well in my early 20s, when I first came into university, I had that negative perception of like Eastern Europe and Russia because of like the UK education system with the Cold War. But I feel education is really important to tackle, also to open up the children's, the students' perception of the low skill sector, that it's not just about the low skill, but it's also an important part. Especially I have the passion of hospitality and tourism, because it's something that we interact and we engage every day. We always go to a cafe, we always go to a restaurant. So there's so much labour there to serve the customers, but then not a lot of the local UK labour are interested in it, because it feels it's low skilled, it's low pay, it's low in, let's say, hierarchy. So I feel like to tackle the low skill sector in the UK, I feel the training and development is really key, and also implementing educational regulations or systems to tackle that, and to make people's perception more open towards it, not just seeing it as a negative thing. But I do know that the industrial strategy does have the investment towards training and development, especially focusing on the UK labour. But again, it's very much focused on the digital economy, which is like the trend, I presume, right now.
I would like to say add something more.
This gentleman.
No, it's me.
Okay.
I would like to say something. I'm studying skills gap as well, and in Essex, I know there is a lot of investment from the government to upskill their own workforce, the British workforce, and there is talks about Brexit and how the workforce is going to affect it, but all these investments, apprenticeship, Levi, or training strategies are focused on British workforce and not for the immigrants. So immigrants or people from Europe are visa-wise as well secondary chosen. If there is no British workforce to fill that gap, then only there will be a European and then immigrant chosen for that kind of job. So there's a lot of investment. It's just a mindset has to change, because there's in the schools. I'm a part of the Essex Skills Board, and they have discussions around schools and the choices. So it's just a mindset of students at that age, what they want to choose and where they want to go in. But there's a lot of investment around that, and there's a lot of opportunities for them, and they have been trying to inform and make progress in upskilling British workforce in general. So it's just catching up on technology.
It's also on that point about perceptions of the low-skilled sector. So I think perceptions need to change partly through education, but also labour protections need to be maintained for that sector, and they've been hard fought for 2 centuries. Every low-skilled sector has had to fight for its labour protections, minimum wages, sickness pay, benefits. Mostly it was women who occupied those positions, and then migrants and so on. But the EU has been a very important part of the raising of those labour protections, and I think we need to remember that as well, and that's something that the EU has done for all of us.
I mean,
flawed as it is, if we don't celebrate the EU in this room, there are plenty of people who won't.
I mean, the funny thing I find is we're having this discussion about low-skilled labor and education, but we're not touching upon the notion of class.
Yeah.
I mean, as long as we're not dealing, like, if you think about our education, we're, even as universities, we're extremely elitist in how we teach. Whenever I mark so those who are teaching, like, you instill, I'm from a middle-class background, I'm very privileged, and you instill these kind of ideas in how you perceive what is good academic work, what is worthy of doing research, what is worthy of doing a particular set of ideas, what is a skill. And we're continually perpetuating this class system, which obviously creates then the perceptions that you don't want to work in a low-class environment, which then you need foreign migrants to fill in. And I think these kind of questions about class and how it all affects what we're talking about should be more at the foreground rather than be left at the background, and that's where labor protections and stuff are very important. To have that discussion and really think about how do we, as a political project then in a way, how do we go to a more, less class-based elitist society, which current policies aren't necessarily aiming at.
Please.
I'm looking into migrant entrepreneurs perspective at the moment, and I found that clear cluster about this Brexit kind of thing. Non-EU migrant entrepreneurs, they don't have that much fear at the moment, while just having initial conversation with them. But the EU migrant entrepreneurs, they are quite intellectual about the Brexit kind of things. In this regard, whatever it is, entrepreneurs, they need a kind of welcoming environment wherever they are from, anywhere in the world. You can see this world has moved towards the business rather than the politics at the moment. You can see different countries having different ideologies. They are becoming tired for the business. So in this regard, after this Brexit, do you see any kind of policies that will address these entrepreneurial activities and to protect their rights and their businesses in the UK?
Who wants to take that?
I mean, it's very much outside my comfort zone. I don't do political economy whatsoever. So whatever I say is very tentatively and should be taken with a very big grain of salt, if not like 2 kilograms of salt. I mean, one of the things I picked up when you said like it's actually mostly EU migrant entrepreneurs who are now suddenly afraid of Brexit and what's going to happen with them. For me, it shows very much how the privilege of the EU migrants, including myself, who have never had to deal with this idea that they're not part of this nation. I mean, we're never part of the nation, but we're always accepted as you can do whatever you want in this country as long as you don't breach the law. Whilst foreign non-EU migrants have always had to struggle and battle to be able to set up their industries within this actually quite hostile environment. So for them, nothing has changed. They are used to this system. Well, suddenly, the reason why I guess EU migrants are now so afraid is because their privileges are being taken away, or at least taken into question. As the plans of current residency, or whatever the name is of the settled status, is going to take into effect, it's actually, like, I looked into it because I was a bit worried because I want to do a postdoc somewhere far away for a couple of years, and I thought, damn, I can't come back to the UK. But the new settled status, if it actually happens, seems to be more lenient in terms of the possibilities to be absent of the country rather than just 2 years. You can now be absent for 5 years, which creates actually more kind of possibilities. But this is all up in the air. Nobody knows what's going to happen with those privileges. And I call it deliberately privileges because as an EU migrant, you're very privileged in this economy because everybody else has been, don't get me started on home office or politics.
Yes, I mean that's take those as rights, right? You call them privileges.
Yeah, but they are privileges.
We take them as rights, as Europeans, right?
Exactly.
And that's why Brexit is so painful. It's gonna take what we have always considered as our own rights.
But this is the whole point: is we always deem ourselves to be better than anybody else, and this is why I started my talk in such a pessimistic way, is because I'm when I started my PhD, I was very pushed by my supervisor to be very apolitical. A political scientist is not political. That's what I was told.
That's why you're a sociologist.
But I'm a sociologist in training, so I had to battle for 4 years with my supervisor, saying, "But no, I disagree. I think it's problematic." And now, I'm finished. I'm free. I can do what I want. I have a job, a temporary job, but anyway. But I feel like I can at least embrace the political nature of my research and really tackle in my research. I deal with a lot of vulnerable people in the Western Balkans. I work for them, want to amplify their voice. But I need to show how, as a European entity, we are extremely privileged, and we are using our privilege on the back of others. And if we don't show those political hierarchies, then we are only going to perpetuate this notion that the EU Europeanness is so much better, and it creates these distinctions where we think we own a lot of things of the world on the back of others. And this is why I call it privileges, because it's so important to recognize that what we have is not a right.
And on the note of non-EU entrepreneurs or labour, like I mentioned previously, the UK is willing to double the Tier 1 visas for highly skilled entrepreneurs as well, including. So I presume the UK is willing to accept more non-European entrepreneurs and labour. So I presume under that and under working in the UK, you will have the rights of protection and so on. So, and especially, I know I've spoken at the speed meeting, dating, whatever else, is on the digital economy, and especially in the UK. Recently, when I was looking, I spoke to some people in London. They're very much interested in the digital economy. So I presume the UK is very interested in non-European entrepreneurs within that field. So I feel it's positive for non-European entrepreneurs.
I think what will determine that question is the political need to deliver economic prosperity to enough people. And this is key. It's departing a bit from this question, but Italy, I'm sure Laura may agree with me, Italy was once, according to any kind of opinion poll, one of the 2 or 3 countries where the popularity of the European Union and European integration was very high, along with Belgium and Luxembourg. And Italy is now amongst the most Eurosceptic, including in some polls, I think even in Eurobarometer, possibly even more Eurosceptic than the UK. And the explanation for this, I think, has to be very simple. I'm sure that there are also more sophisticated ones, which is a perception of the fact that, not the fact, but a perception that Europe or European integration at the present time is delivering to Italy economic hardship, not prosperity. And if your hardship is due to European integration, or you think it is, that's a major issue. And so if your question is, well, what can happen in the UK? At some level, once this Brexit process is concluded, if it's concluded, there has to be a policy in some way to create an environment in which prosperity is more widely shared and redistributed. But I think Brexit only makes that more difficult than ever.
In the student thing, we had a talk, and you said your research was about having experiences of LGBT people with regards to Europe. Could you just talk about that?
I mean, my research is very much focused on rights and policies, so I study legislation and pride parades. This is kind of where I go, because I don't have the language skills to talk to LGBT people in Serbia. I don't have the ability to do this kind of research of lived experiences up into detail, but this is my starting point of how I analyze policies and pride parades, is in what are they doing for lived experiences. In terms of, this is the sociologist in me, I want to know whether what we are exporting or what we're trying to export is actually done in a way where it's improving people's life. And a lot of what I find is, in Serbia, for example, the the enforcement of having a discrimination legislation without the proper notion of how do you create the societal change that's necessary for that kind of legislation to work. Similarly with pride parades, it's created, it's enforced by Europe in one way or another. I've written like 40,000 words on pride parades alone, so I think it's too much to say in this short amount of time, so I'm happy to talk more in detail. But it's enforced in one way or another on Serbia, which created this idea that LGBT is very much imposed from Europe in Serbia, which only created a more hostile environment for people who, for example, if they are discriminated, they are less likely to go actually to the police because they're afraid that by becoming visible, and because if you are discriminated as a gay or lesbian or bisexual transgender person, you have to go declare to the police that you have been discriminated based upon those grounds. So you have to come out, you become visible, and there is some kind of a fear that if you do this, you will only experience more. So this is where I'm looking at. These are things that I've been told through my context and people who work with LGBT people in the region. Obviously, it's second tier data, but that's kind of what I look for, is how our policies which are intended to be good have unintended negative consequences, and that's kind of where
I think LGBT legislation is one of the ways in which countries which have entered the EU later, especially Central Eastern European countries, are trying to resist this kind of perception that values are being imposed by Brussels to all the different countries. And there is a religious element to it as well, obviously, with, for instance, in Poland or in Croatia, the Catholic Church or the Orthodox Church in Bulgaria and Romania and stuff. But also there's degree of moral conservatism and a lack of exposure to these sort of things, which the exposure has been increasing, but it has been increasing along with the perception that these are being imposed and not like naturally arising. We're not necessarily becoming more tolerant, but we have to be more tolerant. So there is that mismatch between the expected behaviors of people and the fact that these behaviors are becoming less and less acceptable socially. But also that doesn't necessarily mean that people are changing and actually becoming more tolerant to LGBT people or to, people of different religious backgrounds or any sort of stuff like that. So it's a really representative battlefront for some reason, LGBT policy in Europe.
If I may add just one more thing about this, I don't know what you know, but today this massive survey of LGBT experiences in the UK has been released, and one of the things that this kind of exposition of LGBT rights to the East and saying like the homophobic East, kind of the trope that's always been used. One of the things it also does is locates homophobia outside Western Europe, which means that actually homophobic experiences of LGBT people within the UK is less seen as something that happens. It's more seen as something, that's just like a random, like a one-off event. It's not a systematic societal event. Like even in London, which is deemed to be very progressive, homophobic attacks and violence is continuously happening. But it's not erased to a full extent, but it's like put to the side, which again has an impact on lived experiences of people who are afraid of also kind of speaking out. Again, especially those who are not white. People who look like me, maybe less piercings, they are fine, generally speaking. It's those who are at the margins of the margins that are constantly put at the expense of these kind of policies.
But this also has an impact on, can I call them rogue governments? So if we talk about Orban's government in Hungary, the fact that these kind of accusations of homophobia are very much focused on Eastern Europe, and the fact that certain levels of homophobia or other elements like corruption are overlooked in Western Europe, they take that to mean that, well, Eastern Europe is being seen as, the bottom of the pyramid, they're being seen as less than, and they're using that as part of their discourse against, or part of the Eurosceptic discourse. They're just seeing us as one or the other, or they're seeing us as the other, essentially, yeah, and less than they are, and because of that, we need to stand up to that. We're not less than them, and they don't have any right to impose that because they're not any better than us. They also have homophobia, they also have corruption, but they don't want to let that show. So, yeah.
Okay, so in terms of what is happening in the EU, because there is a lot of skepticism, right, which is growing. There is also the agenda to continue expanding, I suppose, is it EU? I don't know. How, on a practical level, is the EU responding to these things, whereby countries are saying, you know, you're not good as a union, you're doing bad things, or that kind of thing, and most likely we want to exit? And are they practically responding to those things, to this discord, or are they just pushing on with their agenda? So how are they taking this into account, reflecting on it, and learning from it? Do they have space to do that, for instance, or they're not really doing that?
I think the way that you asked that question is quite interesting. You said they, in terms of the European Union. Who do you think they are?
They, I don't know who they are. Those who make the decisions, because personally, I feel like he was saying, in terms of how even the voting is done, it's done on a national basis.
Who do you think makes the decisions?
I don't make the decision. Well, I'm British. I don't think I make any decision as far as the EU is concerned. That's my own personal position. I have probably a better relationship with just my local MP and deal at that level, and just at the national level. So at that international level, though I did vote to stay in, but I don't know. I don't know whoever is making the decisions and on what basis they're making those decisions, even how the agenda is set. Because as different countries, how do they even bring to say, this is what we're going to focus on?
It's the 27 or 28 member country governments that together make the decisions.
But definitely
and the European Commission is separate from that. It's also a political body. It sets agendas. It implements the decisions. But when decisions are made, the decisions are made by the national governments. And depending on the issue, also the European Parliament. But without the national governments agreeing, decisions are made. So we say the European Union gets the blame for not fulfilling all these expectations. But who is it that isn't actually fulfilling the expectations? Because it's the national member state governments.
So we should turn on our governments instead of turning on the EU. Is that the situation?
Yeah.
I think if we understand that, I feel then we can be able to address, this EU. What is it? Because I just feel far removed from it. As an academic, fine, I feel closer to it. But I can imagine if I was an academic, it would be something that I don't engage with.
So on the subject of Brexit, there were left-wing Brexiteers, similar also to some left-wing anti-system forces in other countries, who criticise the European Union, say the European Union is neoliberal, the European Union is just this union of banks and capitalists, and we shouldn't be part of that, or we should oppose it, or we should change it. And to an extent they're right, but one of the reasons for that is because almost every government in Europe is a right-wing or centre-right-wing government. And if, just on this one example, if the left wants to see, for example, left-wing policy, the left needs to start winning elections in national parliaments. So the question is the problem, if the European Union is neoliberal, is that something intrinsic about the European Union that it does this? Or is it, in fact, just because the centre-right has been winning all the elections? There are those who say that there's something intrinsic, even if the left did win parliamentary elections all over Europe and form all the governments, that because of the structure of the European Union, the way that it's been put together, there is a neoliberal bias. I'm not sure that I agree with that. But that's part of an academic debate. Sorry.
Okay, I think, Yeah, we are 4 minutes past. I'll take these 2 questions, but very brief, please.
I'm from Turkey, and I would like to ask a question about Turkish immigrants.
Sorry, can you speak up, please, so that I can capture what you're saying?
I'm from Turkey,
Thank you.
I would like to ask a question about the Turkish immigrants in the European Union. And right now they have their third generation in Europe, and they, I think, have great problems in integration to society. And I'd like to ask, what's the policy about this, and where's the wrong? Why European Union failed to integrate these people to society?
Okay, hold on for a second. I'm going to take the other question as well.
Mine's more of a statement. It's that rights are irrevocable, privileges are not. And that means that moving around Europe freely is something that can be taken away, so it's therefore a privilege. If you're a classical liberal, the only rights you have are life, liberty, and property. And that's what I am. So I think I agree with you on the end that looking at something as a privilege is not, I know it's a loaded term, and that as soon as someone says, well, you're privileged, you cower and you have to kind of feel sorry for what you have. I don't think that being privileged and acknowledging something is necessarily a black mark against your record. I think just noticing that being able to move around the country and walk into a different sovereign state and being able to work there is an advantage. And I don't think that, I think feeling a sense of entitlement to that is a problem.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to leave the panelists to answer the question about Turkish immigrants, and then we're going to wrap it up. Anyone wants to step in?
All right, very briefly.
Yeah.
I don't know whether it's a question of the EU per se. Immigration policies are very much nationally. I think it is a problem that raises about how do we see integration? What do we think is good integration? Belgium has a very large Turkish migration or population, I should say, which are, depending on what definition of integration you take, are relatively good integrated. In some places, very bad in other places, depending on what sector of society as well. But it's fundamentally about how do we see integration and whether we think it as assimilation, which is currently the more and more trend we're taking in Europe, as in we want people to act like we do, we don't like differences, or whether it's about exchange of ideas and cultures and traditions in a way of creating an open space. I can't answer your question of where they went wrong because it's very nationally oriented, and it's a very big discussion about what do we see integration, which is again very much outside my field. So I'll leave that question for more knowledgeable people.
Okay, I'm going to leave that question for lunch then, which I imagine is going to be served out there. And I really want to thank our speakers.